whether they are religious hardliners or just secular nationalist hardliners. The biggest concern I think that Jordan has today is if the West Bank, in all or part of, is going to be annexed. That is going to be disastrous, not just for the Palestinians, but also for Jordan. And we need to devise a strategy to deal with the administration, a strategy that is multi-pronged, and one that includes, in my opinion, different items. One, we cannot have a confrontation strategy with the United States at this time. We need to find a way to talk to the new administration in a logical way and explain the dangers that such a policy is going to have on the whole region. This is an administration that is primarily concerned with expanding the Abrahamic Accords to include Saudi Arabia and Israel. But if the West Bank is annexed, there is no way, in my view, that the Saudis can sign a deal with Israel. They were close to signing such a deal. The only reason they did not during the Biden administration is because the Israelis would not even nominally agree to a two-state solution to be included in the agreement. A nominal commitment, not an actual one. If that prevented the Saudis from signing such a deal, I don't see how the Saudis can sign a deal if the West Bank is annexed. And therefore, there is an opening here. If we are able to coordinate our efforts with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with other interested Arab countries, and unfortunately I cannot include the whole Arab world because there is no such thing today as a unified Arab position on the peace process or on anything else. But we need a strategy to collectively address what might be coming. I also don't want to over-dramatize the effect of this new administration. We've dealt with Trump before, even if he is coming with a totally sort of different attitude this time. We have friends in Washington. We are not devoid of friends in Washington. Jordan has wisely invested in a long-standing relationship with both parties, with the media, with think tanks, with Congress, and it is a relationship that we need to utilize in order to deal with a very hardline administration for the next 4 years. And we can talk about this. I'm not given much time to talk about everything in detail, but I just want to give you a flavor of what we might be facing in the next 4 years. And then there is Gaza. Yes, we have a ceasefire, and it's great. A ceasefire is badly needed. But we need to work such that this ceasefire turns into a permanent stopping of the war. A hudna, a truce, is not enough. We need to turn it into a permanent ceasefire, a permanent withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. But equally importantly, what is going to happen to Gaza after the war? A lot of people are talking about the reconstruction of Gaza, about an Arab force or some kind of a force to take over. I'm not very optimistic, frankly, about the reconstruction of Gaza. Yes, we are going to see a lot of humanitarian efforts. Khalid's effort is among them. And we're going to see a lot of that. But if we are talking about reconstructing the infrastructure so that people stay on their land, then I'm afraid, not much money is either available or people are willing to give for Gaza, absent a political horizon. Syria, until recently, the civil war in Syria had been over for 6 years. Nobody lifted a finger to reconstruct Syria, or Libya, or Yemen. You talk to the European Union and they would tell you, we are not ready to put in money in Gaza only to see it being bombed a few years later. You talk to the Gulf and they will tell you the same thing. And remember, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Who is going to present a political vision to not just deal with Gaza, but deal with the whole issue of the occupation? I'm afraid nobody. There was a glimmer of hope, just a glimmer of hope, that a second Biden administration might look at the issue. And even then, it was highly doubtful. With Trump, I have zero hope that the Trump administration is going to offer a political horizon to end the conflict. Trump's ambassador to Israel publicly, openly says that this land was given by God to Abraham and his descendants. Even if you believe this, people forget sometimes that Abraham's descendants were not all Jews. The Arabs are included as part of Abraham's descendants, but I'd rather not get into a religious argument over the land. My sincere prediction is that the conflict will stay with us for a while and will even expand, as it has been, to the West Bank. I do not see any serious hope of a political initiative to end the occupation. Where does this lead us? The international community has been talking about a two-state solution forever. But at least for the last 10 years, it hasn't paired it with a credible plan to implement that two-state solution. A two-state solution doesn't develop out of its own. It needs ending the occupation. It needs separating the two communities. And it needs a political will to do that. None of these three conditions are there. And with 750,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, it is practically impossible to separate the two communities, even if the political will exists to end the occupation. And we all know the political will does not exist. Is that a pessimistic scenario? Not necessarily. In my view, not necessarily. We have a number of factors that are working in favor of the Palestinians, but in a generation's time, not today. And I know nobody wants to talk about 20 years later, but I'm afraid there is no short-term solution to the conflict. Three factors I want to mention. One, the demographic factor. The number of Palestinians today in areas under Israel's control is larger than the number of Israeli Jews. 7.5 million Palestinians versus 7.2 million Israeli Jews. Out of the 7.5, of course, 2 are citizens of Israel in a second-class status, and 5 are under occupation. That means that if Israel does not succeed in mass transfer, and it's a big if, we don't know, It might succeed. But if Israel does not succeed in mass transfer, then we are dealing with an apartheid system that I think the international community will not accept indefinitely. Today, it's an apartheid one-state reality. Today. And I don't mention the word apartheid in an emotional sense, but in a legal sense. When you have two legal systems applied to the same group of people living on the same land, that's the legal definition of apartheid. Two, we are witnessing a generational gap around the world where the younger you are in age, the more likely you are to support Palestinian rights. That's not true just in our region, but around the world. In a generation's time, we are going to see these people assume positions of power. And their view regarding the conflict is going to change, in my view. And we can talk about that later. And the third factor is the legal one. We Arabs don't put much trust in legal matters, in international legality, because international legality has not served us well. Because UN resolutions regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict were all taken according to Chapter 6 and not Chapter 7, meaning that they are not mandatory, they are not binding. And so we just don't trust UN resolutions, for good reason. For good reason. But what we are witnessing today is another legal track, which is the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court track. Unlike UN resolutions under Chapter 6, these decisions are binding. In the case of the International Court of Justice, they are binding to all UN members. And in the case of the International Criminal Court, they are binding to the countries that have signed them, but we are talking about 124 countries. I realize fully that even with that, Israel is not going to commit to any decisions by these two courts. But in 10 years' time, it is not just Israel that is going to be held accountable, but every country that deals with Israel. If, for example, the ICJ comes up with a decision that says what is happening is genocide, then every country that has aided genocide is going to be held accountable. You put all these three factors together, and I think the future is not as pessimistic as we think it is. But unfortunately, as I said, we're not going to see it develop imminently. And then there is Syria. Syria is very important because what happens in Syria is not going to stay in Syria. Syria has already given us 3 lessons. These lessons keep being repeated in the Arab world, but nobody wants to listen. The first lesson is that the Arab Spring is not over. How many times did we hear officials tell you the Arab Spring is over? How many times did we hear this? In this city, in this country? Well, the Arab Spring will be over once the problems that face Arab countries are addressed. If these problems are not addressed, people are going to rise. Not all waves are going to be successful or democratic or inclusive, but as long as the problems facing Arab countries are not addressed properly, which is the case today, we are going to see successive waves of the Arab Spring. People went home in 2013 not because their problems were solved, but because they were afraid of the outcomes. Some did not want the Islamists to come to power, some did not want chaos to come to power, but that did not mean that the problems were solved. And as long as they are not, we are going, in, as I said, to see successive waves. This is the first lesson. The second lesson that Syria is teaching us: brutality does not ensure stability. You can be as brutal as you want. And I can argue that the Syrian system is as brutal as any in the world, not just in the Arab world. It did not help the Syrian regime in the end. That's the second lesson that needs to be learned. Stability comes from addressing people's problems. It doesn't come through brute force. Brute force will only slow things down, but will not solve the problem. The third lesson: the removal of a brutal regime like that of Bashar al-Assad is a necessary condition for a stable and prosperous Syria, but not a sufficient one. I'm an engineer by background, and this necessary and sufficient equation, those who are engineers in the room understand what I'm saying. It's a necessary. In other words, without it, you cannot even start to build a new future, but it's not sufficient that just because you remove a brutal regime, you're going to replace it with a pluralistic, inclusive regime. That is still to be seen. That is still to be seen. And the international community can do two things. It can say, this is an Islamist regime, we don't want to have anything to do with it, these are people that belong to ISIS, etc., etc., etc. And if the international community does this, I think it's going to push the new Syrian regime towards being an Islamist, exclusive, non-democratic regime. Or the international community can say, we are ready to work with the Syrian regime, but not unconditionally. You show us signs of inclusiveness, we will show you signs of lifting the sanctions. You have an inclusive government, we will help reconstruct Syria. And the Syrian regime needs the international community. It needs it to lift the sanctions that are, severe. It needs it to reconstruct Syria. Nobody, like I said, is going to put any money in Syria without an inclusive system. And it needs it to bring back the refugees, who today, look at what happened today. I mean, how many Syrian refugees went back from Jordan? Practically none. Not because they don't want to go back, but because they don't have anything to go back to. Their homes are destroyed, their infrastructure is destroyed, their schools are destroyed. And so if we want the refugees to go back, we have to help in reconstructing Syria such that that becomes possible. And I will say something that might be a bit provocative. Not everybody wants the Syrian regime to succeed. Not all countries in the region want the Syrian regime to succeed. Because if the Syrian regime succeeds, then it's going to put pressure on others to also engage in reform. And so you already have, I don't want to name countries because I don't want to get in trouble, but the countries that are today openly and publicly against the new Syrian regime, because any success is going to reflect negatively on their own situation. These are some of the challenges that face Jordan in 2025. We're a small country. We cannot do it alone. We need alliances. But I do not want to either belittle the problems that we face. They are going to be serious. I also don't want to over-dramatize them and say that we are helpless. We are not helpless, but we need to deal with the new phase in a way that is different from the way we've dealt with earlier crises. This time, the crises are tremendous. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Marwan.